Depression, something fun, okay? Okay, so two last topics, Great Depression today and the New Deal, the political response to the Great Depression by Franklin Roosevelt next time. That will end all of the material for exam number 2, okay? Notice that a lot of times when we talk about the Great Depression, this is, without question, the worst economic crisis in all of American history is the Great Depression. Financial disaster of really, a magnitude we've never experienced. And if you remember just briefly over the last couple of years as we're sort of dealing with some of these, economic crises now, how many times that has been referenced, right? That was, we averted or we're about to enter into the worst economic time since the Great Depression, right? So the Great Depression is still this measuring rod for the economic hardship, okay? So I want you to understand that the Great Depression is really about a 15-year period. It begins not just with the stock market crash in 1929. That's a major part of it, but it was already underway before then. And ultimately what gets us out of the Great Depression, a gigantic stimulus package is what got us out of it by building a war machine. Right? The end of World War II. So this is not just the mid to early 30s, but this is a very long period in American history. Okay, so let's just sort of introduce it with some sort of major, sort of big picture comments here. Right. First of all, the Great Depression is one of these moments where it is going to profoundly change the relationship between the people, the citizenry, and the government, particularly the federal government. Okay? So remember back, well, really up until this point, but particularly when we're talking about the sort of industrialization and the role of the federal government and the presidents during the Gilded Age and sort of national politics in the late 19th century. And I said, in times of crisis, for example, economic crisis, but natural disasters, right? Various, crises where the citizenry are affected dramatically. Whose job is it to be concerned about the people, right? Well, it was not the job of the federal government. Well, today it is the job of the federal government. It is their responsibility to deal with major catastrophic problems, be they economic, be they foreign policy, be they natural disasters, right? So it creates this modern welfare state that we live in today, all right? And we want to be very careful when I use that term welfare state, what that means. That does not just mean handing out food stamps to poor people, okay? What it means is that the federal government assumed a responsibility to deal with the welfare, that is how the citizenry are doing in general, right? And one of their fundamental responsibilities is to solve, or at least attempt to solve, these problems, right? So the world that we live in today is largely, particularly that relationship between us and the federal government is a product of the Great Depression, because the situation was that, one of the phrases that you've heard, right, is that in hard times you kind of pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. Right? That is a quintessential American value right there that, particularly from a male perspective, that it is the job of a man to care for his family, to be a provider, to be a breadwinner, these kind of, little out-of-date today sort of, characteristics of men. But the point was that you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. You don't accept charity. You don't get, help from people. You do it on your own, right? And the problem is that in the Great Depression, you can't do it on your own. You got no boots, let alone straps to pull them up, right? There is only one entity large enough, powerful enough, with enough economic credit to deal with this problem, or at least attempt to deal with it, and that's the federal government, right? There's nothing larger, nothing else that is able to do it, right? Now, ultimately, this is going to see a statistic that is staggering: 25% unemployment. 25%. Now that is the national average, 25%. In many places it's higher than that, right? So we have to consider that depression of 1893, so back in the late 19th century, we had a depression. and at the time, the worst one in our history until the Great Depression. Statistics of unemployment were about 20%. So 1 out of 5 people, employable people, were unemployed, right? Well, now we see 25%. 1 out of 4, again, the key is not 1 out of 4 people, 1 out of 4 employable people, 1 out of 4 members of the workforce is out of work, right? So this doesn't factor in elderly people, children, single mothers, people with disabilities, people who are unemployable, right? So it is a staggering statistic, and this is the number that you'll have to pay attention to get a sense of when do we finally get out of the Great Depression, right? It won't be until we get heavily involved in hiring people to build the war machine to deal with World War II. Okay, so unemployment is a key statistic here. I think as well that it creates this sense of fear and uncertainty for the future. The Great Depression probably caused more doubt that the United States would survive in any kind of recognizable form than any other catastrophe in American history, except for maybe the Civil War. Right? The Great Depression, many people thought, as a nation, particularly in terms of our two, at least proposed stated values of democracy and capitalism, that we were done as a nation. We were not going to survive in any kind of recognizable form, right? And so the Great Depression really creates, right, in this time of chaos and panic and uncertainty and disorder, this is where the fringe starts coming out in huge numbers to the far left and to the far right. All right? So, as an example of what I mean by that, there are a lot of countries, because this is a global economic crisis. I mean, we kind of caused it, but it's a global crisis, right? Sort of like we caused the recent one as well, right? That a lot of countries didn't survive the Great Depression. Most importantly, of course, is going to be the Republic of Germany, which falls under the weight of the Great Depression. And a man named Adolf Hitler will rise to power, exploiting that fear and uncertainty about the future. Right? So this is going to be a huge test for the political leaders of the United States to try to deal with this problem. Right? And I think, too, there is a certain sense of psychological impact that we have to keep in mind as well. You know, this is a time where stockbrokers are jumping out of windows, committing suicide because they saw no hope, no future. Absolute despair that the United States was not going to survive in any recognizable form. This creates this sort of emotional panic. And in times of crisis, what is it that people want more than anything else? Somebody to promise them order and stability. Remember what Harding had gotten out of the end of World War I, right? A return to normalcy. That's what people are looking for. And anybody that promises that, people are going to listen to them. And again, this is going to bring out the fringe, the far left, the far right. We're going to actually have the American Nazi Party demonstrating in Madison Square Gardens with George Washington as this icon with swastikas all around him, attracting thousands of followers. We're going to have 2 American Communist parties to the far left, right? So this is a time where the United States is really at its most uncertain in terms of whether we can survive or not, right? So it profoundly affected not just economics, not just the relationship on a political level from the government to the people, but I think in many ways this uncertainty as to whether or not we were going to survive, okay? Now, what I want to do first, just not necessarily quickly, but we kind of go through this, is to get a sense of what causes the Great Depression, right? And I'll make this case, I'll make this statement several times that had we done this, it would have been less, in terms of the problems would have been less. But I think in many ways, the overall Great Depression was really a symptom, or symptomatic, of an unhealthy economy in general. All right? So no matter what I'm going to suggest that had we done this or that, it would have prevented it, but it might have made it less severe. Okay? Now, the number one cause here is industrial overproduction. All right? Now, this goes back to the 1920s. Remember that in the 1920s we see massive efficiency in manufacturing. Profits from World War I, those cost-plus contracts, are going to be used to reinvest in technological innovation and improvement. Transition to electricity as a much more reliable and efficient source of power means that in the 1920s we became much better and more efficient at manufacturing, right? And the point is that the 1920s was such a sort of boom time, right? That there is manufacturing at a really, it's just not checked at all, right? Now here's the problem with this, right? With industrial overproduction. The term here is going to be retrenchment, right? We saw this briefly in politics after the First World War. Retrenchment just means to downsize, all right? So cutting back, okay? So we're talking about layoffs. We're talking about reduction in wages and salaries. But the problem here is that what is the overall health of the American economy based upon by the time we get to the late 20s and early 30s? What's the key indicator as to whether or not we're healthy as an economy? Can consumers buy stuff, right? Consumer purchasing power, okay? So notice what just happens here. If you produce so much stuff that we can't consume at all, right, what's the first thing you're going to do? Cut production, okay? Now, what is one of the major costs of production? Labor, absolutely, right? So now what you've just done is the health of our economy is based on consumer purchasing power, and you've just reduced it by cutting wages, cutting salaries, or actually firing and laying people off, right? So this begins a sort of spiraling down effect, right? And that's going to be the problem here, is because so many of these factors are intricately connected that if one of them falls over, it pulls the rest of them down, right? So cutting back on production, cutting back on in terms of manufacturing, producing as much stuff, all of that's going to be cut, and cut drastically. But one of the major costs is labor, and that too is going to be reduced, right? So from the very beginning, right, this is going to reduce consumer purchasing power. Okay? Now, there are a lot of limits on consumer purchasing power in addition to reduction of wages and salaries and layoffs, right? So in addition to that, right, what we're starting to see is some very interesting trends developing by the late 1920s, right? Remember that the stock market crash of 29 is not the cause of the Great Depression. It is a symptom more than it is a cause, right? And that's why I intentionally on your handout there drop it down, okay? First of all, again, we have this gap, right, between level of production and level of consumption, right? That is, more being produced than people can consume. The other problem is that one of the big purchases of the 1920s, in fact, the most important one, was the automobile of the 1920s. It created this domestic boom cycle, right? Huge impact on the economy. Again, stimulated it in terms of, raw materials, employment, right, etc., construction, all of these sorts of things, roads, suburbs, etc., all the things we talked about last time, right? But the problem is that when you bought a Model T, unlike today, these cars lasted, right? There was no buying a car and turning it in 3 years later, or no, leasing cars and just keep making payments. You bought the car, you paid for the car, and you drove the car, and it lasted. So the problem is, how many people are going to repurchase a car? Very few. So it has this kind of initial impact, but then it plateaus, and then it sort of kind of tapers off a little bit. So that economic boom of the 1920s from the automobile, huge for the 20s, it's not sustainable because these cars last. They're a durable good, right? And by the way, this is going to be one of the major things, particularly after World War II into the 1950s and 60s, that American automobile manufacturers started a concept called planned obsolescence. You want these products to decline quickly so that people will have to buy more of them later. If you buy or build a car that lasts, then people won't keep buying them, right? They're going to learn that right here in the 1920s, right? The other thing was that those people that couldn't afford to outright pay for the car got credit, consumer credit, during the 1920s. But the problem was, like in recent years, we have a credit crunch, right? Meaning that it becomes harder and harder for consumers to actually get credit, right? Because much of that consumer credit had largely been exhausted by the end of the 1920s. So the point is that you're only going to be able to purchase things based on your wages and your salaries because you can't get credit. But then you're seeing your wages or your salaries being reduced because of retrenchment and downsizing of production, right? So we're also going to see, and this is an interesting, these sort of last limits on wage increases and missed opportunity. These are kind of together, right? We saw in the 1920s one of the most prosperous the most prosperous decade in American history up to that point. Productivity rose 70%. The average American worker productivity increased throughout the 1920s by 70%, which when productivity increases like that, we're going to see massive profit. Okay? But the problem with that was, and I said, you throw this phrase out there, the most prosperous decade in American history, but how many people benefited from that? How many people, average, middle-class people, shared in that wealth? Not very many, because the average worker's wages increased 20%. Productivity goes up 70%. Labor salaries went up, wages went up about 20%. There's a 50% gap between productivity increases and wage increases, which means that much of that wealth, in fact, the great majority of that wealth, is going where? To the hands of very few people. Right? Now remember I said back in the late 19th century when we started this industrialization process, business owners, maybe begrudgingly, increased salaries, increased wages. Why? Because they knew their workers were not only workers but consumers. They would turn around and buy the same materials and it kind of fuels the economy. Right? Business owners in the 1920s refused to do that, or they did it in a much smaller degree than we saw back in the late 19th century. So the problem here is now you're starting to see an excessive concentration of wealth in the hands of very few people. All right? Now, I'll give you an example of this. You don't necessarily have to write these statistics down, but just roughly speaking, it gives you a sense of what I mean by concentration of wealth. Our economy is based upon mass consumption. A lot of people buying a few things is much healthier because it spreads it out than it does with a very few people buying a lot of expensive goods. Okay? So throughout the 1920s, we're going to see that the top 1/10 of 1%, that is the super rich in America in the 1920s, had as much collective wealth, and that's about 11,000 families or so, roughly speaking, that top 1/10 of 1%, had as much collective wealth as the bottom 42%, roughly speaking, about 24 million families. Right? So you have about 42% of the lower income people having as much total wealth as 1/10 of 1%. That is a recipe for disaster because I don't care how rich you are. How many toasters are you going to buy? How many automobiles are you going to buy? You may buy a lot of those, right? How many? There may be a gold-plated toaster, but you're not going to buy 100,000 of them, and that's what we need. It is mass consumption. So this is one of the problems here, is that it was a missed opportunity to increase wages that ultimately would have cycled back into the economy because, let's face it, we're not real good at saving. We spend it as fast as it comes in, but at least it keeps the economy going, right? This is one of the big consequences of, back to our word for the semester, industrialization. It put us on the path to consumer-oriented economy, right? So this excessive concentration of wealth helped to create this situation because it was tied up in the hands of very few people. Now, flash forward to today. The difference between the top 1/10 of 1% today and the bottom percentage, the bottom part of the United States today, it is much greater today than it's ever been in our nation's history. Right? It's a recipe for economic disaster, which also helps explain why we're in an economic crisis right now. All right. Okay, so again, major cause overproduction. Number two, lots of various limits on consumption in addition to business retrenchment, cutting workers, cutting production and salaries, layoffs, etc. Number three, though, we had another really interesting economic situation in the 1920s with American industry and business in general. what we had in the remember back to the early progressive era, that turn of the century merger boom, right, where it literally created through lots of companies merging together, big business, corporate America, right? Because of the fear and uncertainty with what that would mean to individualism and competition, it created the progressive movement, right? Well, now we got into the 1920s, and remember what I said, Republicans are in office, they're doing quite well because the economy is doing well, all this prosperity. And so what we also saw then was another merger boom in the 1920s, where we have even more concentration of industry, or the elimination of hundreds of smaller companies. Okay? Now, what's the consequence of that? Well, it's very similar to excessive concentration of wealth just in the hands of the very rich. That is, what we're seeing here is even less competition and the rise or the expansion of more oligopolies in the 1920s. Now we go back to what that term oligopoly was, because we saw this back in the late 19th century. This is where a small handful of companies, 3, 4, 5, it's not a monopoly, not one, but again, a small handful, they control an entire industry. Right? And this is the problem here, is because if you're an oligopoly, the goal is not to compete, but to cooperate with the other businesses in your oligopoly, right? So the point is that you establish or control prices, labor, production, and therefore you're no longer competing but cooperating with each other, right? And here's the problem with that. Oligopolies, because they control an industry, they set the prices. Now we have this kind of myth that somehow supply and demand in a free market, free enterprise capitalist economy, that supply and demand set prices. That is somewhat true. I mean, companies can't just, set prices as high as they absolutely want, but it's not about competition and supply and demand. It's about there's no other options here because they set the prices. Which means that if it's not supply and demand setting the prices, when demand falls because people can't pay for this stuff anymore, price should come down. But it didn't, because supply and demand didn't set the price to begin with. The oligopolies did. So demand's falling off, prices are staying high. Okay? Now, today this would be much faster and easier to recognize with computers and things like that. They don't quite realize this until about 1932. 1932. Now that's about 2 to 3 years into the Great Depression here, right? Where prices have been staying relatively static, but demand has been falling up. And by the time they sort of figure it out and start slashing prices, it's too late. It's too late. Blue collar, that is sort of working people's purchasing power, had been cut by 50% by 1932. So this is one of the big problems here, is that by the time they do react, because they finally figure out what's going on, it's too late. We're already in the Great Depression. 1932 is the worst year of the Great Depression. That is where it's absolutely the worst, right? That's that 25% unemployment, right? So the problem here is that if you have excessive concentration of industry, the establishment and acceptability that oligopolies are okay, then we eliminated a safety valve here that would have sort of figured out and sort of brought prices back down, which again, I'm not saying that it would have prevented the Great Depression, but had prices come down, at least relative to demand or close to relative to demand, then people could have been able to purchase more of these things and not have the dramatic layoffs and the dramatic cuts by 1932, right? So oligopolies are going to be another major reason, this excessive concentration of industry for the Great Depression. Okay, I intentionally put the stock market crash down because I want you to make sure that you're not jumping right to the stock market crash as the cause of the Great Depression. It is one of the, I would argue that it's really more a symptom of a sick economy, is what it was, right? And by that I mean an unhealthy economy, okay? Stock market crash in the fall of 1929. Now, throughout the 1920s, I might have mentioned this last time, there was a speculation boom, right? That is, you sort of think about, if you've ever done much with the stock market or at least followed it, or maybe your parents or something like that, The advice that we're oftentimes given is, you invest in the stock market. It's a long-term investment. There's going to be sort of ups and downs. But overall, nothing performs better as far as a return on your investment than the stock market, right? And so as long as you're in there for the long haul, you're going to be okay, all right? Now, that's not necessarily sound advice, but that's the advice that most of us are given, right? And there's merit to that philosophy of investing, right? Doesn't quite make as much sense today, but this has kind of been what we're told throughout most of the 20th century. There's long-term investment, not short-term investment, right? And the problem here is that if you actually subscribe to that long-term investment over years, you might get a 5, 6, 7% return on your investment, maybe a little higher than that. That's a solid return, but it's nothing spectacular. But what you're seeing in the 1920s, when we call it a speculative stock boom, was this quick buy these stocks and turn around and sell it for a profit. All right? Buy low, sell high, make a quick profit. And in the 1920s, you could see a 30, 40, 50% return on your investment. So again, you can sit there and say, well, why would all these people do this? Because they can make a lot of money doing it, right? It's not, I wouldn't say it's their fault. It's the economy, it's the system itself that allows this to happen, right? Now again, this is not necessarily a bad system, necessarily. But the problem is, and we saw this back in the 1990s with the dot-com sort of bubble and then bust there, but the problem is that if I buy low and I turn around and sell, and by the way, we say sort of this term buying on margin, that's really the way to go. It means that I don't got to put much down at all of my own money, right? I only got to put 10% down. Now where am I going to get that 10%? I'm going to borrow that 10% anyways, right? Probably from my stockbroker. I'll borrow the 10%. Buy 10, put that down, turn around and resell it, take all this money, pay back my 10% that I owe to my stockbroker, and then walk away with a bag full of money, right? But the problem is, every time you do that, what happens to the value of those stocks? It goes up. It goes up because that's the key to this, right? But the problem is, what is the real value of the stocks? It's all paper. It's all illusion, right? And the problem is that when you get into the fall of 1929, this has been going on for years now, right? I think I said this phrase last time. The statement was, or the question was, what kind of stock should we buy? Well, it doesn't matter. It's the 1920s and the Republicans are in office. They're all going to go up. Well, they all did go up. But they come crashing back down in 1929 because ultimately it's that person that's left holding the stocks at the end when they can't resell it for a higher profit, that now has to do what? It's going to have to pay all that back, right? And this is where the crash comes, okay? And here's what I mean by the crash. Okay, so I am just an average sort of middle-class investor, right? And I have a portfolio of stocks. Here comes the crash. All of my stocks are no longer worth what they were because of all this speculation. So the value of my stocks has now crashed almost to nothing, right? Okay, I took a personal hit with that, my financial loss. But that is the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg, right? And here's why. Well, wait a minute. Oh, thank God I still have my savings in my bank account, right? What does the bank do with the money that you put in your savings account? Invested in the stock market. Banks begin to fail. Savings accounts gone. Oh, thank God I have my pension. What has your pension fund been doing? Invested in the stock market. Pension's gone. Thank God I have my life insurance. What's your life insurance company been doing with that, right? Do you see how all of this stuff is tied back into the stock market? So when one of these things falls, it wasn't just personal loss. It was a systemic failure across the board here. All of these institutions are drugged down, and they fail by the hundreds, if not the thousands. Okay? So the point here is that now there's this psychological impact here. Right? This is what I mean by why stockbrokers would literally jump out of 10, 12-story buildings, or they're committing suicide because they see no hope, no future. Right? We're done, right? Because it all comes crashing down. Right? So we have let me bring that numbers with me here. We have on the stock market the Dow Jones today, right, which is trading, or Where are we at now?
About 11.1.
A little over 11. Okay, so in terms of volume, right? Well, in the summer of 1932, let me rephrase that. In the summer of 1929, right around Labor Day of 1929, we are trading roughly at about 458 points volume. Okay, so obviously a much smaller market than we're talking about today. Okay, but by October of 1929, and on the day of the crash, we go down to 58 points volume. Trading 58 points. We're at 11,000 now. We're down at 58. Right? So get a sense of that. In almost one day, $78 billion lost. $78 billion in cash and investments. Right? So this was the sort of like the house of cards that came crashing down here, and that's the psychological impact that I'm talking about. People literally said there's no hope here, right? And suicide seemed like a more viable option than trying to figure out how to get through it, right? So, and obviously, once you have the stock market crash, all of that retrenchment that has been going on is going to be accelerated. Much more layoffs, much more firings, many more wages cut, salaries cut, businesses closed, banks failed. It was a disaster. Right? But I just want you to understand that this had been sort of building since really throughout the 20s. And where was the SEC, that is the government regulatory agency to oversee the stock market? Doesn't exist. Right? This is going to be one of the major sort of reform movements here coming out of the Great Depression is government regulation of not just not just the stock market, but banks, investment banks, commercial banks, the entire financial system. We're going to see have to be overhauled here, and that's what we'll talk about next time is the political response to this. Lastly, we can consider the international or foreign trade here. Remember what I said, that Republicans in the 1920s, they reclaimed the White House, they reclaimed the Congress, and they reinstituted record high protective tariffs. Tax foreign goods excessively high to encourage Americans to buy domestic product. Now, this was going to lead to other countries doing the exact same thing to us, taxing our products that we're trying to get into their markets and getting their people then to buy their domestic products and not buy American products, right? So you get into these tariff and trade wars this way, okay? But the problem is that you didn't really realize it, the full impact of that in the 1920s because of the automobile and all of the related consumer goods, that we had such a vibrant domestic market that you didn't really feel the pinch of the decline in the international markets. So this is one of those points. Again, I'm not saying that had we had lower tariffs it would have prevented the Depression, but it would have made the Depression less severe because we would have had greater access to foreign markets. And we didn't because of these record high protective tariffs because of Republican policies, right? So now we are going to not only have that sort of decline in international goods, or international trade, but because we are staggered at home by this financial collapse, we are no longer able to keep investing, particularly in places like Germany, but in various European markets, that much of Germany was propped up by American investors. Well, all of that money is going to be pulled out of Germany, right? And other countries as well. That's what I mean by this financial underpinning of European markets, right? We pulled that out, and when we did that, that's what's going to cause Germany and other European nations, their markets, to collapse as well. So this is why it's going to spread from country to country to country, because the United States is no longer going to be able to maintain their investments in international markets. Okay? Which, of course, means that this is going to, cause not only Germany to collapse and default on all its reparations, the Allied powers that were paying us back from World War I, they're going to default on all those loans. So all of that tremendous, fabulous wealth that was created as a result of the way the First World War ended now has kind of blown up in our face less than a decade later, right? It's pretty much gone, or at least it's going to all be restructured over much longer periods of time. Okay? So all of these factors together, right? I mean, again, it is sort of a perfect storm. We could have weathered, any one of these things, but when all of this hits at one time, that's what leads to the Great Depression. Now, let's consider a couple of things here. One, the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, Republican, probably the most talented of all of the Republican presidents, had served as Secretary of Commerce in previous administrations. He understood international trade. He was quite good at this. In fact, had been played a key role in, I think I mentioned this before, providing food to Russian people to prevent famine during the Russian Civil War in the early 1920s. So Hoover was internationally regarded as a great humanitarian, right? But I think in many ways that Hoover and his mentality here, and that's what's at work here, what's at play, is a product of the 19th century. He has a 19th century mentality. In times of crisis, it is not the job of the federal government to deal with the problems of the people, right? Not in a wholesale, massive way, the way we'll see after the Great Depression, right? So Herbert Hoover said that we've had depressions before. We've gotten through them before. You can't legislate your way out of these economic crises. And as a result of that, he tended to he did some moderate, food, and but very little, right, in terms of actually alleviating immediate suffering of people out of work, homeless, not even able to feed themselves. He did very little to alleviate that suffering, right? Because it's not his job. Pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps, tighten your belts, right? It's that kind of a mentality, and that mentality just doesn't work with this wholesale economic collapse, right? Now, he does come up with something called voluntary cooperation, right? And the key here is it is not mandated, it is not law, it is a program in which he believed that the federal government, particularly the White House, their job was to kind of sort of create an atmosphere where negotiations could take place between business, between labor, between manufacturers, and kind of, let's get everybody together to figure this out, right? But it's not mandatory, right? It's not mandated, it is voluntary, okay? Now, what he argued, an example of one of the policies he put forth in voluntary cooperation, which some businesses actually adhered to, right? Trying to adhere to the president's advice. Voluntary cooperation specifically called for holding the line on wages. What do I mean by that? Meaning he's saying businesses should continue to pay their workers the same wages despite this economic downturn because it allows consumer purchasing power to stay roughly steady, and therefore they can continue to buy stuff, and it'll kind of help us get out of this economic crisis. Here's the problem with that. When businesses actually adhered to voluntary cooperation and held the line on wages, even though demand is falling way off, what's actually doing is that it's going to cause more problems in the long run because you are expending all of this money to pay workers, but demand is going way down, right? Had these businesses fired more people sooner, or laid them off, or reduced their wages sooner, then what would have happened is you wouldn't have this big gap between holding the line on wages and supply or demand. Because what's ultimately going to happen is obviously unsustainable. What's going to happen? Now you're going to have massive layoffs. Massive layoffs. So had you actually fired a few people earlier and cut production costs earlier, you might not have had such whole-scale unemployment, right? So voluntary cooperation was an absolute failure. It actually made the situation worse, right? But again, I think it's symptomatic of a 19th century mentality that it is not about legislation. It is not about trying to get the federal government to figure out ways to get out of this problem. It is really more the hope that business leaders will be able to figure this out, and the president will serve as a mediator to make that happen. So here's the response, particularly by Hoover, right? First of all, we're starting to see these wonderful little shanty towns all around the United States in urban and suburban areas called Hoovervilles, right? These are people who have lost their homes. They're homeless people who literally are living in shacks. Again, this guy's roof is a part of a fence, right? So these kind of Hoovervilles are showing up all over the place, right? As millions and millions of people are becoming homeless, right? So obviously there's a sentiment here that the president is not doing enough to deal with this problem, okay? But perhaps most importantly, we had an event take place in the summer of 1932. This is the famous Bonus Army. And the Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans. World War I veterans. They had served their country, fought for the United States in World War I, and as a reward for their service, the federal government promised them a pension, a bonus, a cash payment, later in their life, right? This would have been in the late 40s, probably early 50s, but late 40s. That is basically a sort of a retirement package, for service to your country later in your life, when you're not quite able to take care of yourself as much, the government's going to give you a big chunk of money. Okay? So again, service for your country, sort of a pension fund. Well, 1932, we're in the midst of the Depression here, and these guys, these veterans of World War I, marched on Washington, D.C., and demanded their bonuses now. We need it now. Times are hard. Getting through the Great Depression. They want their bonuses now. All right. Now, the decision by the Senate, who is ultimately responsible for yes or no, said no, you can't have them now. All right? The reason for that, of course, was that the government doesn't have the money. At least that was their argument, their defense. We promised it later in life. Again, it seems kind of harsh, particularly for veterans who are out of work, homeless. But regardless of the harshness of being told no, it's what happens next that is going to really seal the deal here for the Republican failure throughout really the next 50 years. Is Hoover ordered the regular army, that is the real army, led by General MacArthur, one of the heroes of World War I, some of his lieutenants like Patton, Eisenhower, right? You probably will hear of these guys later in World War II. They were young officers now. To move these guys out of Washington, D.C. They had come to Washington, set up one of these Hoovervilles right across from the Capitol building, and, again, trying to negotiate a settlement. Congress said no, and the president ordered that shanty town burnt to the ground, and these veterans who had served their country driven out of this shanty town. Right? And the whole thing was caught on film. Now, this is the summer of 1932. What's about to happen in November of 1932? Presidential election. And I don't care who the Democrats ran against the Republicans, that person was going to win. All right? Remember, this is caught on film, and it is shown throughout, in movie houses and theaters throughout the nation, October into November of 1932, right? This is how you treat veterans that serve your country here, is to burn their shantytown as they're begging for money because they're out of work. This is how you treat American veterans. Again, the harshness of being told no is one thing, but to turn the real army onto these guys, several of them died in this incident as they are literally driven into the Potomac River, right? So the Republicans are going to, again, this is Hoover's response, right? This international humanitarian, but he's not willing to do this for people at home, particularly veterans. So this is going to spell a disaster for the Republicans at the polls in 1932. Now, the other thing we might think about, just to kind of get a sense of, again, this is the shanty town, right? There's the Capitol building. The whole thing was burnt to the ground. The Great Depression is also full of all sorts of depressing images. Bad word there. But it kind of, I just want to show you some pictures here to give you a sense of the misery, the suffering that's taking place here, right? This is a time where people really felt that there was no hope, there's no future, right? This is where, again, migrants are a big issue in the 1930s here. People particularly, I'll show you images of the Dust Bowl here in just a moment, but agriculturally speaking, one of the ironies here is that there's a tremendous amount of abundance on the farm, right? This is, the Great Depression agriculturally began back in the late 20s as we are producing more food than we can consume, right? But the irony of that is in the Dust Bowl, which is northern Texas, Oklahoma, southern Kansas, sort of the Central Plains, right? Massive 10-year drought is going to force all of these farmers to have to pack up and head west, looking for jobs as migrants, particularly picking agricultural produce in California, right? So this is perhaps one of the most famous images, and it's a series of them, just to kind of get a sense of it here, right? Of a migrant camp, of a single mother with several kids here. Again, you can get a sense here of the despair in her face. What's she going to do? She's got nothing here. Right? How do you take care of your kids? Right? How do you feed them? Right? By the way, this is something a lot of people are dealing with today as well. Right? So several images here, but this may be one of the most famous series of portraits or photographs here. Right? This is where we start to see soup kitchens, bread lines. Right? One of the famous phrases was, right, that hope is just around the corner. That's what Hoover kept saying, right? Hope is just around the corner. But in fact, what's around the corner are literally thousands of people in lines trying to get just a little bit of bread, a little bit of soup, right? Again, just extreme poverty here. And here's the irony of the Great Depression is this. Have we had poor people in this country for a while? We've always had poor people, right? And what's been the response by the general sort of attitudes here towards people that have been suffering like this for forever, right? Well, they're poor. That's what you expect, right? The problem is that now these middle class people who had been largely doing okay, particularly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they also begin to suffer. And that's when this suddenly becomes a major issue here. Remember that this poverty that we're talking about has always existed. It's just the scale of the poverty here. Yeah.
Around this time, how was life in the South? Is this more up north? You see these soup kitchens? The people set up...
This is all across the United States.
So it's like this in the South as well?
This is everywhere. This is everywhere. Absolutely. Right? Again, you see soup kitchens, bread line, right? Literally a big bucket of, water with a little salt, pepper. Right? There's nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. Right? Despair, fear, uncertainty. And you have a government that just, again, burnt down this shantytown. If that's what they're going to do to veterans, we're doomed, right? That was sort of this is some of the images of the Dust Bowl, right? Again, add that sort of element of all this economic crisis, and one of the big problems that the Dust Bowl, this 10-year drought, in many ways was man-made, right? Because what they had done is put the plow to these fields so excessively that when the drought actually came, the ability of the soil to hold what little moisture there was is gone. The topsoil is all gone, right? That is, over-farming the sort of Central Plains actually exacerbated this situation on top of a massive 10-year drought, right? That's why, again, it's all of these things coming together at one time. You could survive any one of these things. It's when they all hit at the same time, right? They literally would talk about dust clouds. They called it... they call that black pneumonia or something like that. Where again, you're talking about dust just in your lungs, all over the place here. They would just come and just black out the entire community, the entire farm, right? So what we're starting to see here is this just abject misery and poverty here as all of these economic forces hit at one time. Okay. Again, we could look at a lot more depressing pictures. I think you get a sense of what's going on here. But what's about to happen in 1932 is going to be a political realignment in which, under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic Party is now going to emerge as the dominant party of the United States for the next 50 years or so. So that long-standing Republican dominance, right, in the end, they are going to take the hit for the Great Depression. Now, whether they caused it or not is not the issue, right? Some of their policies helped create it, but again, it's more of a systemic failure of the economy as a whole. But when you're in office and bad things happen, you take the blame for it, right? Franklin Roosevelt is going to come in 1932 and win a landslide election, right? And he is going to be elected for 4 consecutive terms. He will serve in 1932, 36, 40, and 44. And he will see us through the Great Depression and World War II. And that's something we'll talk about next time. All right. We're going to get out early today.